Hello, and welcome back to Chords and Queens, the podcast dedicated to celebrating and amplifying the extraordinary work of female composers and musicians throughout history. I'm your host, Jennifer Athen, and I created this show because these remarkable artists and their groundbreaking works deserve to be heard, studied, and celebrated. On today's episode, we're looking into the life and work of one of the world's greatest music teachers, Nadia Boulanger. Have you ever thought, what do Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, and Philip Glass all have in common? Well, they all at one point in time studied with the incredible musical genius that is Nadia Boulanger. Born in Paris on September 16th, 1887, Nadia Boulanger would become perhaps one of the most influential music teachers of the modern era. But her story begins in a household already steeped in quite a lot of musical tradition. Her father was Ernest Boulanger, a composer, conductor, and singing teacher at the Paris Conservatoire. At the, some may say, very ripe age of 62, he married Raisa Machetsky, a Russian singer who was 43 years younger than him. I'm not judging, I'm judging a little bit. I'm not judging, I promise. So in this musical household, and being the child of musical parents, you would expect Nadia to be as obsessed with music as perhaps her parents were. But you would be wrong, surprisingly. Apparently, Nadia really disliked music as a child and would leave a room if she heard it being played, which I find quite amusing. But I guess maybe if you're a child and you're constantly hearing music not only being played around you, but they were probably practicing and hosting what I assume would be like jam sessions in the living room with their musical friends. And if you're listening to this and you're a musician, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But if you're not, let me explain to you why someone might be put off by this, particularly why a child might be put off by this. Essentially, if you're practicing any instrument, or you and a group of other musicians are rehearsing or learning something, you're usually playing the same 8 to 16 bars over and over and over again. So I almost sympathize with baby Nadia, because if you grew up in a household like this, you might definitely be put off music forever. Because hearing the same sound over and over again would drive anyone mad, let alone like a small child who doesn't really understand what's going on. But that's just my opinion on the situation, and perhaps why I think, and I'm not surprised that perhaps baby Nadia just wasn't interested in hearing music ever again if she was hearing it all the time. Fortunately for us and the world though, she didn't despise music forever. And I know you're probably wondering, well, what got Nadia into music? Was it some emotive concerto, or perhaps an intricate yet complicated piece of piano music? Well, you'd be wrong. It was actually a fire bell. Yes, you heard that correctly, a fire bell. At the age of only 5, apparently the beautiful drone of the fire bell, which, please note my sarcasm, was enough to make little Nadia rush over to the piano and try and recreate the sound. I think that whole scenario and image has got to be one of the best stories I've heard as to why a kid got into music, and it seems from this moment on, she was hooked. Now, her younger sister Lili was born in 1893 when Nadia was only 6 years old, and Lili also showed exceptional musical talent. The relationship between the two sisters would become one of the most poignant aspects of Nadia's story, and to be quite honest, it's truly a mixture of deep love, collaboration, and also comparison. If you want to know more about Lili Boulanger, I did make a podcast about her life and work last week, so feel free to check that out as well if you can't get enough of the Boulangers so far. Now back to Nadia though. Even though early on she didn't like music, that didn't seem to stop her from becoming a prodigy. At around age 9, she took part in the solfege exams used to assess musicians' ability to recognize, sing and notate musical elements using solfege syllables. So think the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And in this competition, she came 3rd place. And just for further context, she was actually the youngest participant out of the 55 women taking part. So that was a pretty important and huge achievement. And it was only a year later she took 1st place. I'm sure the Boulanger home became a salon where the greatest musicians of the day would gather. With this exposure, young Nadia must have absorbed not just musical technique, but the culture and intellectual discourse surrounding music. Unfortunately, though, tragedy struck early in Nadia's life when her father died in 1900 when she was just 13. The loss would profoundly shape her character, instilling in her a fierce independence and determination that would define her entire career. Around this age is also when she wrote her first song called Extase, the translation being ecstasy, which I find quite curious as to why she named it that. I don't think I had that kind of vocabulary at 13. Which, speaking of vocabulary, let me read you the lyrics. I was alone, near the waves, in a starlit night. Not a cloud in the skies, on the sea, no sails. My eyes dove further than the world, the real world, and the woods and the mountains and all of nature seemed to question in a confused murmuring. The waves of the sea, the waves of the sea, the fires of heaven, and the golden stars, infinite legions, in high voice, in low voice, and with 1,000 harmonies, set in bending down their crowns of fire, and the blue waves that nothing governs or stops, said in curving the foam of their crests, it is the Lord God. When I read that, I was like, what kind of teenager at that age writes such beautiful, emotive, melancholic lyrics? Like, forget teardrops on my guitar. Move over Taylor Swift. This takes the cake for being just gut-wrenching. So not only does she have this undeniable talent, but she has the accolades to go with it. She won the first prize in harmony in 1903, but also in 1904 she won the first prize for organ, fugue and piano accompaniment. Who needs Grammys? She also wrote a song at 18 called Écoute la chanson bien douce, which became her first published work. But she set her eyes on perhaps a grander prize, the Prix de Rome. We talked about the prize on the episode about Lili Boulanger, but just to summarise the Prix de Rome, it's essentially a very prestigious French scholarship award, awarded to promising composers. Established in 1803, it was part of a wider French arts scholarship that included painting, sculpture and architecture, and the winners were then granted a bursary to live and work in Rome, which is pretty cool, right? Often at the Villa Medici, and were expected to create new musical works. The competition involved setting a text, often a cantata, and was super competitive, with some famous composers like Berlioz, Bizet, and Debussy among its winners, as well as Nadia Boulanger. In 1907, she entered the competition and even got to the final round, however was unsuccessful at scoring the top prize. The next year, though, she became a bit of a rebel. She submitted her composition for orchestral instruments only. And if you're thinking, what's the big deal? Well, she used no voices, and that's what was instructed. The deliberate rebellion seemed to work in her favour as she managed to secure her place in the final round, although this enraged many people, like the composer Saint-Saëns. In total, she entered the competition 4 times but never took first place. Instead, in 1908, she became the first woman to win the second Prix de Rome for her cantata La Sirène. This was a remarkable achievement in an era when women composers faced enormous barriers. The Prix de Rome was the most prestigious composition prize in France, and Nadia's recognition seemed to herald a new era for women in classical music. However, 1913 brought an event that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Nadia's life. Her younger sister Lili became the first woman ever to win the first Prix de Rome, at just 19 years old. Lili's victory was groundbreaking, but it also cast a shadow over Nadia's own compositional ambitions. And I did speak about this in Lili's podcast episode that I made, just talking about how incredible Nadia was as an older sister. She didn't seem to be publicly affected by it. Like, it didn't seem to diminish her work or maybe cause conflict between her and Lili, which maybe it did. I would love to know more about that. But I do think that's to her credit that she sort of almost swallowed her pride and thought, well, I'm going to promote my younger sister's music and help her. She's amazing and talented. But I also think, Nadia definitely paved the way. She was entering the Prix de Rome before Lili, and that was probably, even subconsciously, to the people around her going, oh, well, Nadia's composing this sort of music. It's getting into the competition. Maybe there is a place for women here. And I truly think that paved Lili's way. So unfortunately, Nadia maybe had to bear the brunt of that initially, but at the end of the day, it was her sister that took first prize. And I wonder if she thinks, I would rather it be my sister to win and be the first woman ever to gain this incredible achievement rather than perhaps some stranger. But I do just love these two as siblings and sisters so much. I just think they're the best and the cutest and the greatest. And there should be like a movie about them. I would love to see it, please. Someone at, I was going to say Marvel. That would be weird. But yes, just the complex dynamics between the sisters during this period reveal so much about Nadia's character. Rather than harboring sort of resentment, she threw herself into supporting Lili's career. She really helped orchestrate Lili's works, promoted her music, and served as both sister and professional collaborator. And after the attempts at the Prix de Rome, she still continued to compose music, even collaborating with fellow composer Raoul Pugnal on an opera. Unfortunately, though, Pugnal dies in 1914 and the opera was never performed. And after his death, Nadia's music output really went downhill. There is a little bit of debate of like whether they were romantically involved, but nothing's ever sort of concrete in stone, so it is up in the air. Perhaps maybe she was affected by his death more than we know, and that's why she sort of took some time out, but again, that's just speculation. It was also around this time that World War I erupted, and both Nadia and her sister Lili contributed to the war effort through music. They organised concerts for wounded soldiers and composed patriotic works, but the war years also saw Nadia beginning to shift her focus from composition to other musical activities, including conducting, performing, and increasingly teaching. Probably the most heartbreaking moment of Nadia Boulanger's life, or at least it's the most heartbreaking to me in their story, came in 1918 when Lili died of chronic illness at just 24 years old. Lili had been working on a PA at the time of her death, which Nadia would later help complete and promote. Lili's death devastated Nadia and effectively ended her own career as a composer. In interviews later in life, Nadia would say that she realized she was not destined to be a great composer. That recognition belonged to Lili, which just crying. While this may seem like self-deprecation, it actually gives us an insight perhaps to her priorities. I think it must have been really hard to have a younger sister in the same field as you and watching her flourish. And especially after she's died, how much more complicated do those emotional feelings get as well? You know, knowing that she was so talented and so amazing but had her life taken away from her at such a young age. I definitely think that that would make composing hard for anyone. Never mind your sister who was in the same field as you. Like, surely every note she was writing, she must be thinking about, I wonder how Lili would write this. I wonder how Lili would phrase this. And that's what really breaks my heart. From 1918 onward, Nadia dedicated her life to preserving Lili's musical legacy and to teaching. She organised performances of Lili's work, supervised recordings, and ensured that her sister's music would not be forgotten. This devotion continued throughout her long life. She was still promoting Lili's music well into her 90s. And I'm sure the decision to abandon composition was not made lightly. Nadia had genuine talent and had already achieved recognition, but her choice reflected a deeper understanding of her own gifts. Perhaps she recognized that her true genius lay not in creating new music, but in understanding, interpreting, and teaching the music of others. This transition period also saw Nadia beginning to establish herself as a teacher. She had been giving private lessons since the war years, and word was spreading about her extraordinary ability to analyze and develop and nurture young talent. And the 1920s marked the beginning of Nadia's international reputation. American students, drawn by Paris's reputation as the center of musical innovation, began seeking her out. Aaron Copland arrived in 1921 and became perhaps her most famous, or arguably her most famous, American student. Under her tutelage, he developed the distinctive American sound that would categorize works like Appalachian Spring and Fanfare for the Common Man. But what made Boulanger such an extraordinary teacher? Well, first, her analytical abilities were unparalleled. She could dissect a piece of music with surgical precision, revealing its harmonic structure, the motive development, instruments and formal architecture. But beyond technical analysis, she had an intuitive understanding of what made music expressive and meaningful. Her teaching method, though, was rigorous and demanding. Students would analyze Bach chorales to understand voice leading, study Fauré songs to grasp harmonic subtlety, and examine even Stravinsky's latest works to comprehend modern techniques. She insisted on understanding music from the inside out, not just how it sounded, but why it worked. Perhaps most importantly, and one of my favorite things about her, was Nadia never tried to make her students compose in her style. Instead, she helped them find their own authentic voices. This is why her students, from the neoclassical Copland to the experimental Elliott Carter to the populist Virgil Thomson, could sound so different from each other, while all bearing the mark of her excellent training. The 1920s also saw Nadia beginning her conducting career. She was one of the first women to conduct major orchestras, breaking yet another gender barrier in classical music. Her last known composition is from 1922, titled J'ai frappé. And no, it wasn't inspired by her Starbucks order. Instead, the translation is My hand has struck, and I'll read you the lyrics. My hand has struck closed doors, and other hands have replied from afar. My brow has struck closed doors, and other brows have replied from afar. My heart has struck closed doors, but only my heart's echo replied. It's quite a dark song, and the chords are super heavy and fatal. And I always wonder, was this her farewell to composition? There's a lot of literature out there that suggests Nadia was plagued by self-doubt and criticism, or the comparison that she would never be as great as her younger sister. But I often wonder if she stopped composing because it reminded her too much of Lili, which I talked about just a little bit before. I think what's really sad to me is we will never know. So let's continue on with her time as a music teacher. In 1921, Nadia became a professor at the newly established Conservatoire Américain at Fontainebleau, just outside of Paris. This position would become central to her life and work for the next 6 decades. Fontainebleau had been created to allow American students to study French musical traditions with French masters. Nadia's classes there became legendary. Students would arrive expected to learn composition techniques and leave having experienced a complete musical education that encompassed history, analysis, performance, and even musical philosophy. These weren't just lessons, they were intellectual salons where music was dissected, debated, and celebrated. Nadia would play through scores at the piano, sort of analysing everything from Bach fugues to Stravinsky. And students learned not just the technique, but how to think about music. Her famous collective of students were quite comically referred to as the Boulangeries, which is the French word for bakery. Each brought their own musical personality to her studio, and each left with a deeper understanding of their own craft. She was also one of the few distinguished European teachers that would take American composers seriously. Therefore, lots of aspiring music writers flocked to Paris just to get the opportunity to study with a European great. The appeal was essentially the rigorous training. Studying music in Europe was not for the faint-hearted. It was seen as a grueling process, and one American teachers had yet to kind of adopt. So let's take some time to unpack why her teaching style was so famous and what made her such a good music teacher, I hear you ask. Well, Nadia appears to have no sympathy for excuses, laziness, or even tiredness. She had an unwavering work ethic that's pretty admirable, yet for some, maybe a little bit unattainable. She would get up at the crack of dawn to attend mass, eat breakfast, and reply to all of her mail before teaching from 8 a.m. in the morning until 12 midnight. And she's even quoted as describing sleep as 5 hours of nothing. If you were her student, you were expected to comply with this lifestyle as well. She was the poster child of discipline and hard work, and above all else, she prioritized oral training, but would also ensure her students had a thorough knowledge of score reading, counterpoint, harmony, and figured bass. Despite this, her lessons mostly focused on the practical side of these skills, and even by stressing the importance of knowing music off by heart. She said, "You are enriched by the music you know by heart. It becomes a part of you." But overall, her main goal with her teachings was not only to establish an unwavering foundation of music theory and harmony and counterpoint, and even ear training. The bigger picture was that she wanted each of her students to find and cultivate their own musical style. She really nurtured each composer's own voice and uniqueness. But even with all of this, she definitely still had her favourite students. Sometimes I think of her as Professor Slughorn. If you're a Harry Potter fan, you'll know what I mean. But Nadia also invited her favourite and best students to socialise with her in her home. And all I keep thinking is how devastated you would be if you were a student that didn't get invited round to her house for a wee tea and a sandwich. I fear I would be the student that wouldn't be invited round for the wee tea and the sandwich. Nadia's teaching influence went beyond just teaching composition. She taught conductors like Leonard Bernstein and performers like the organist E. Power Biggs. Her almost holistic approach to musical education meant that all her students, regardless of their speciality, emerged with a comprehensive understanding of musical style and structure. During the 1930s, as political tensions rose in Europe, Nadia's studio became even more international. Students came not just from America, but from across Europe and even Asia, seeking to study with the woman who was increasingly recognized as the greatest music teacher of her generation. When World War II erupted, Nadia faced a difficult decision. Many of her Jewish and foreign students were in danger, and Paris itself was becoming increasingly unsafe. In 1940, she made the difficult choice to leave France for the United States. Her wartime years in America, though, were remarkably productive. She taught at several institutions, including Wellesley College, and continued to attract talented students. She also performed as a conductor and pianist, becoming the first woman to conduct the Boston Symphony Orchestra and the New York Philharmonic. But Nadia never forgot her responsibility to preserve and transmit musical tradition. Even in the States, she continued to promote the works of French composers, particularly her beloved sister Lili. She organized concerts, gave lectures, and maintained correspondence with students and colleagues around the world. After the war, she returned to France and resumed her teaching at Fontainebleau. If anything, her reputation had grown during her American years, as students now came from around the globe to study with her, and she continued teaching almost until her death in 1979 at age 92. The final decades of her life saw her receive numerous honours, including being made a Commander of the Legion of Honour, France's highest civilian decoration. But perhaps her greatest achievement was simply the continuation of her work, teaching, analysing, and preserving the musical traditions she had spent her life mastering. Nadia's legacy is almost impossible to quantify. She composed relatively little music herself, but her influence on 20th century music was immeasurable. Through her students, her analytical insights shaped everything from American musical theatre to avant-garde classical composition. She proved that teaching music could be a creative act of the highest order, that understanding, interpreting, and transmitting musical knowledge was as valuable as creating new work. In an age that often celebrates individual genius above all else, Nadia reminds us that the greatest artists are sometimes those who help others find their voices. Her life spanned nearly the entire development of modern music, from the late Romantic era through to Surrealism, Minimalism, and beyond. Through it all, she maintained her commitment to excellence, to rigorous analysis, and to the belief that music, when really understood, could illuminate the deepest truths about the human experience. I also think it's worth reflecting on our own music teachers and how much of a difference they can make when they're kind and passionate, but also driven like Nadia was. I truly think that a music teacher can make or break your relationship towards music or to your instrument. So to me, it was so interesting diving into Nadia's legacy, whilst always having that in the back of my mind. I also think her work ethic and dedication to her craft is something really aspirational, and who knows, maybe I'll try a day in the life of Nadia Boulanger and see if I can sustain my musical brain from 8 a.m. to midnight. I'm gonna say no. But anyway, that's all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, you can subscribe to this channel, and you can also give us a follow over on Instagram and TikTok, where I post lots of little stories about female composers at Chords and Queens. Until next time, see you later.